You've replayed the conversation at least a dozen times, not because you're trying to hurt yourself, because you're trying to understand, because if you just think about it long enough, if you find the right angle, the right interpretation, everything will finally make sense. You'll know what to do. You'll stop feeling this way. That's what you tell yourself. Here's what no one has told you. The thing you call thinking it through is not analysis. It is a loop. And loops don't produce answers. They produce more loops. You've probably been told at some point that you think too much, and you probably dismissed it, because from the inside, overthinking doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being thorough, careful, serious. It feels like you're the kind of person who doesn't rush into things, who considers consequences, who takes the weight of decisions seriously. That feeling is the trap. Because what Kahneman found, after decades of mapping how the human mind actually works, not how we wish it worked, is that more deliberate thinking does not produce better decisions. Past a certain point, it produces worse ones. Not slightly worse. Measurably, demonstrably, structurally worse. This isn't a character flaw. It's a design flaw, and it's been running your life. Daniel Kahneman spent his career doing something most people find deeply uncomfortable, proving that the mind is not a rational instrument. It is two instruments, two systems with completely different architectures, completely different speeds, and completely different costs. And the overthinker, without knowing it, has learned to use only one of them. For everything, at every moment, until it breaks down. That breakdown doesn't look like a collapse. It looks like Tuesday. It looks like staring at a menu for 10 minutes and still not knowing what you want. It looks like a draft of a message you've rewritten 40 times and never sent. It looks like lying awake at 2 a.m., not because anything is wrong, but because your brain refuses to stop working. What Kahneman would tell you is that you're not thinking too much. You're thinking with the wrong part of your mind. And you've been doing it so long, you've forgotten there was another option. That other option is what this video is about. You don't have one mind, you have two, and they hate doing each other's job. Kahneman spent decades mapping this architecture, and what he found cuts through every self-help myth about willpower, discipline, and rational thinking. The brain operates through two fundamentally different systems, not metaphorically, but structurally. System 1 is fast, automatic, and effortless. It reads the room before you know you're in it. It recognizes faces, detects danger, forms impressions, and generates intuitions, all without asking your permission. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and expensive. It calculates, compares, plans, and reasons. It does the hard work of conscious thought, and it is exhausting to run. Here is the part that matters. Both systems are necessary. Neither is superior. The question is never which one is better. It's which one belongs in this situation. System 1 was built for pattern recognition, for decisions you've made 1,000 times before, in domains where experience has quietly accumulated over years. It doesn't need to analyze because it already knows. A chess grandmaster doesn't think through every possible move. They see the right move, the same way you see a word, and don't sound out each letter. That's System 1 doing exactly what it was designed to do. System 2 belongs somewhere else entirely. Novel problems, high-stakes decisions without precedent, situations where intuition has no experience to draw from. The overthinker collapses this distinction completely. Every decision goes through System 2. What to eat, what to say, whether that tone in someone's voice meant something, whether to take the job, whether that choice from 3 years ago was a mistake. System 2 gets drafted for all of it, not because these decisions require it, but because the overthinker has learned to distrust anything that arrives without effort. If the answer came quickly, it doesn't feel earned. If it didn't cost anything, it doesn't feel real. So they keep thinking. And System 2, which was never designed to run continuously, begins to buckle under the weight. Kahneman describes System 2 as a lazy controller. Left alone, it conserves energy. It delegates back to System 1 whenever it can. This isn't laziness in the pejorative sense, it's efficiency. The brain is not trying to be irrational. It's trying to survive a world with more decisions than any conscious mind can properly process. The problem isn't that System 2 is weak. The problem is that the overthinker refuses to let it rest, and in doing so, turns a precision instrument into a blunt one. What you experience as thinking it through is often System 2 running on fumes, recycling the same information in slightly different configurations, generating the feeling of progress without producing any. The loop continues. The decision doesn't come, and you wake up the next morning and start the whole process again. But there's something worse than the loop itself. There's what happens to your thinking when the loop runs long enough. Because the longer System 2 runs without resolution, the more it starts to distort the very information it's trying to process. That's where we're going next, into the illusion that all this analysis is actually bringing you closer to the truth. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Here is the belief underneath all of it. If you think long enough, you will eventually arrive somewhere safe. That belief is the core of the problem, not the thinking. The belief that thinking is a path to certainty. That somewhere at the end of enough analysis, there is a door, and behind that door is the right answer. And once you find it, you will finally be able to act without fear. Kahneman would call this an illusion, not a harmless one. He identified something he called the law of least effort. The principle that the mind, when left to its own devices, defaults to the path of lowest cognitive cost. System 2 is not eager. It does not volunteer. It gets recruited when System 1 signals that something requires more than intuition. But here is the twist. When System 2 is overworked, it doesn't become more precise. It becomes more susceptible. It starts cutting corners while maintaining the full sensation of rigorous thought. You feel like you're analyzing. You are rehearsing. This is the illusion of control. The overthinker mistakes cognitive activity for cognitive progress. The brain is busy. Therefore, something productive must be happening. But busyness is not clarity. Movement is not direction. And the sensation of thinking hard is not the same as thinking well. What actually happens during a prolonged deliberation is quieter and more damaging than paralysis. The mind starts to fill gaps with assumptions. It starts to prefer internally consistent narratives over accurate ones. Kahneman called this, "What you see is all there is." The mind builds a complete, coherent picture from whatever information is currently available, and then treats that picture as reality. The longer you deliberate, the more elaborate that picture becomes. And the more elaborate it becomes, the more real it feels, even when it's almost entirely constructed. You've done this. You've taken a silence in a conversation and built an entire theory of what it meant. You've taken one decision and traced it forward into 12 possible futures, each one feeling more inevitable than the last. You were not discovering the truth. You were authoring it. And System 2, depleted, overextended, had no mechanism left to tell the difference. The cruelest part is that this feels like diligence. It feels like you're taking things seriously, like you're the only one willing to sit with the full complexity of a situation. Everyone else acts too quickly, decides too easily, doesn't think about consequences. You are different. You are careful. But careful and trapped are not the same thing. And the longer you stay inside the loop, the harder it becomes to see that the loop was never leading anywhere. It was just keeping you from having to find out what happens when you leave it. What you haven't seen yet is the cost, not the psychological cost. You already know that. The cognitive cost. What overthinking actually does to the brain's capacity to decide at all. Because System 2 doesn't just stall when it's overloaded, it depletes. And depletion changes everything about how you think, including on the decisions that actually matter. System 2 has a budget, and you've been spending it on the wrong things. Kahneman's research, along with work by psychologist Roy Baumeister, established something that should disturb you. Every act of deliberate thought draws from the same finite pool of mental energy. Conscious reasoning, self-control, decision-making, they don't have separate reserves. They share one. And that pool depletes with use, the same way a muscle exhausts under load. The phenomenon has a name: ego depletion. And once you understand it, you will never look at your worst decisions the same way again. Here is what depletion actually looks like. Judges reviewing parole cases were found to grant parole far more often at the start of the day, and far less often as the day wore on, defaulting increasingly to denial, the safest, lowest effort outcome. They weren't becoming crueler, they were becoming depleted. System 2 was exhausted, and an exhausted System 2 stops weighing evidence and starts reaching for defaults. This is not a failure of character, it is a failure of resources. Now think about your day. You woke up and immediately began deliberating. What to wear, whether that email needed a different tone, whether you said the right thing yesterday, whether this plan is actually a good idea, or whether you're missing something. By the time you reach the decision that actually matters, the conversation you need to have, the choice that will genuinely affect your life, System 2 is already running on empty. And an empty System 2 doesn't rest. It panics, it loops, it generates the sensation of thinking without any of the function. This is why your worst decisions often happen at night. This is why you say things you didn't mean after a long day. This is why you've committed to things you didn't want, or avoided things you did, in moments that felt clear at the time but weren't. You weren't weak. You were depleted. And you depleted yourself on trivialities, on decisions that System 1 could have handled in seconds if you had let it. Kahneman found that the depleted mind doesn't choose nothing. It chooses the default. Whatever requires the least resistance becomes the answer. Not because it's right, but because System 2 no longer has the capacity to push back against it. The overthinker, who prides themselves on never taking the easy way out, ends up enslaved to defaults precisely because they exhausted their capacity for real deliberation hours earlier. The practical consequence is devastating and simple. You are spending your sharpest cognitive hours on problems that don't deserve them, and arriving at the problems that do with nothing left to give. That's the depletion trap. But depletion alone doesn't explain the full wreckage of overthinking, because even when System 2 is running at full capacity, the overthinker has built something inside the analysis itself that guarantees distortion. A set of invisible filters that bend every piece of information toward a predetermined conclusion and grow stronger, not weaker, the longer the thinking continues. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. You believe that more analysis means fewer blind spots. Kahneman spent a career proving the opposite. The cognitive biases he mapped, confirmation bias, anchoring, loss aversion, the narrative fallacy, are not corrected by deliberate thinking. They are amplified by it. Every additional hour you spend inside a decision is another hour these distortions have to embed themselves deeper into your reasoning, dressed up as logic, invisible because they arrived through effort. You don't recognize them as biases. You recognize them as conclusions. Take confirmation bias first. The moment you begin analyzing a situation, your mind forms a preliminary impression, faster than you're aware of, generated by System 1 before System 2 has even started. From that point forward, Everything you consciously analyze gets filtered through that first impression. Information that confirms it gets weighted heavily. Information that challenges it gets minimized, reframed, or quietly discarded. The overthinker, who reads everything, researches everything, considers every angle, is often doing nothing more than building an elaborate architecture around a conclusion they reached in the first 30 seconds. Then there's anchoring. The first number you hear shapes every number that follows. The first interpretation shapes every interpretation that follows. Kahneman showed that people adjust insufficiently from whatever anchor they start with. And the more they deliberate, the more that anchor solidifies, because each new thought is built on top of the last one rather than independent of it. The overthinker isn't thinking freely. They're excavating deeper into the same starting point. Loss aversion does something crueler. Kahneman found that losses feel roughly twice as powerful as equivalent gains. For the overthinker, this means that every prolonged analysis tilts, almost inevitably, toward catastrophe. The longer you think, the more the potential downsides expand in your mind, growing vivid and specific, while the upsides remain abstract. You're not being realistic, you're being asymmetrically afraid. And you've mistaken that fear for prudence. And underneath all of it runs the narrative fallacy. The mind's compulsive need to turn disconnected events into a coherent story. Kahneman was direct about this. Humans are not wired to tolerate randomness. We find patterns where none exist, assign causes to coincidences, and construct explanations for outcomes that were largely determined by chance. The overthinker's internal monologue is not an analysis. It is a novel, and the longer they write it, the more convincing it becomes, not because it's accurate, but because coherence feels like truth. This is what you've built inside your own head. A machine that processes the world through a set of systematic distortions, then produces outputs that feel rigorous because they cost so much to generate. The effort is real. The clarity is not. But knowing this isn't enough. Understanding your biases intellectually is itself another loop. Another way of thinking about thinking, which is exactly where the overthinker is most comfortable and least effective. What actually breaks the pattern is something different. It's learning when to stop using the tool that's failing you and trust the one you've been refusing to use. Because there is a part of your mind that has been quietly competent this entire time, and you've been drowning it out. You've been taught to distrust what comes easily. That's the first thing to unlearn. Kahneman did not write a book celebrating intuition. He spent much of his career exposing its failures. But he was precise about something that often gets lost in that conversation. Intuition fails in specific conditions, and it thrives in others. The overthinker treats this nuance as binary. Either thinking is reliable or feeling is, and defaults entirely to analysis because at least analysis feels defensible. But defensible and correct are not the same thing. Here is what Kahneman actually found. System 1 builds genuine expertise in environments where two conditions are met. There is enough regularity in the domain to form real patterns, and there is fast, clear feedback that corrects errors over time. A chess grandmaster has played hundreds of thousands of positions. A firefighter has walked into burning buildings for 20 years. An experienced therapist has heard the same evasions in 10,000 different voices. In these domains, what feels like a hunch is actually compressed experience. Pattern recognition operating below the threshold of conscious thought, faster and often more accurate than any deliberate analysis could produce. The overthinker has experience too, more than they realize, in the domains that matter most to them: their work, their relationships, the texture of their own emotional life. They have accumulated years of data. System 1 has been processing all of it, quietly, without their permission. And then, they override it. Every time an answer arrives quickly, they assume it must be wrong. Every time something feels clear, they manufacture complexity. They have trained themselves to distrust the very signal that is most calibrated to their actual life. Kahneman was specific about when this goes wrong. Intuition fails in genuinely novel situations, where there are no patterns because you've never been here before. It fails in low feedback environments, where outcomes are delayed so long that System 1 never learns from its mistakes. It fails when emotion is so loud that it masquerades as intuition. These are the places where System 2 earns its cost. Everywhere else, forcing deliberate analysis doesn't add precision, it adds noise. Think about the decisions in your life that you're most at peace with. The ones that didn't require weeks of deliberation. The ones where you knew, and then you acted, and the knowing turned out to be right. You probably don't think of those as intellectual achievements. You think of them as luck, or instinct, or somehow not counting. But they count. They count more than you've allowed. The work is not to stop thinking. It is to learn the difference between a decision that needs System 2 and one that is simply being held hostage by it. Novel, irreversible, high stakes, no prior experience. That is where deliberate analysis belongs. Familiar, reversible, pattern-rich, experience-backed. That is where you let go. Where you trust what you know without requiring yourself to prove that you know it. That distinction sounds simple. It is not. Because the overthinker doesn't just overuse System 2 out of habit. They overuse it out of fear. And fear is not a cognitive problem. It is something older and harder than that. Which means the final question isn't about which system to use. It's about whether you're willing to make a decision at all, knowing it might be wrong, knowing there is no analysis that removes that possibility, knowing that certainty was never on the table. Here is the truth you've been circling this entire time. There is no version of thinking that makes deciding safe. That's what the loop was always protecting you from. Not a bad decision. Bad decisions happen to everyone, including people who barely think at all. What the loop protects you from is the feeling of having chosen. Because if you never fully commit, you never fully own the outcome. The analysis gives you somewhere to live that isn't quite inside the decision. A vestibule where you can stay indefinitely, telling yourself you're almost ready, almost certain, almost there. You are never going to be certain. Kahneman was clear about this, not as a consolation, but as a structural fact. The mind was not built to achieve certainty. It was built to navigate uncertainty well enough to survive. Every tool he mapped, the heuristics, the systems, the biases, exists because the world moves faster than deliberate thought can follow. The goal was never perfect information. The goal was good enough, fast enough, to keep moving. So what does that actually look like? It looks like building a budget for your thinking and honoring it. Before you analyze, decide how long this decision deserves. 30 minutes, 2 hours, 1 day, based on its actual stakes, not its emotional weight. When the time ends, you decide with what you have. Not because you've eliminated uncertainty, but because you've given the decision what it's owed and nothing more. It looks like using Kahneman's pre-mortem. Before committing, imagining the decision has already failed and asking what went wrong. Not to paralyze yourself further, but to surface the 1 or 2 real risks hiding inside the fog of general anxiety. Specific fears are workable. Ambient dread is not. It looks like protecting your system too, the way you'd protect any finite resource. Automate the trivial. The same way the decisions about what to wear or what to eat for breakfast can be made into non-decisions, rules you follow without deliberating, so that your cognitive budget is intact when something real requires it. Stop spending precision on problems that don't deserve it. And it looks like this. When you are in a domain where you have real experience, and the answer arrives quickly, and your body knows before your mind catches up, you let it. You act. You tolerate the discomfort of not having justified it to yourself in 12 different ways, because that discomfort is not a warning signal. It is just what it feels like to trust yourself. The hardest part of all of this is not intellectual. You already understand the framework. You probably understood it before this video was halfway through. The hard part is that stopping the loop requires you to sit with something the loop was specifically designed to prevent you from feeling. The possibility that you might be wrong, that you might fail, that the outcome might not vindicate you, and that you will have to live with that either way. That is the psychological challenge Kahneman leaves you with. Not a technique, not a system, a confrontation with the fact that thinking was never going to save you from the experience of being human, uncertain, fallible, and required to act anyway. If something in this video named something you've been carrying for a long time, leave it in the comments. Not what you think about it, what you recognized. The distinction matters. And if you're still here, something has already shifted. That shift doesn't complete itself in a single sitting. There's more underneath it, and part of you already knows where this goes next.